The original Shadow Dragon for the Famicom was a clunky and basic game that released to rather poor reception. Yet the game sold well, and was too successful to leave unignored. This was probably a surprise for Intelligent Systems, since the original Fire Emblem was not much more than a fun side project for them. Yet the team rose to the challenge. Shozo Kaga stepped up his involvement, becoming director for the series. With development for Gaiden beginning a few months after Shadow Dragon's release, one of Kaga's main goals was to address the complaints of the original game. But with the series still being on Famicom, there was only so much they were capable of on a technical level. The best solution was probably to rework the gameplay foundation to provide a more comfortable experience. Releasing in March of 1992, Gaiden was about as well received as its predecessor. Most critics agreed the general gameplay was improved from the original, but because both games are so radically different, they were hard to compare. Gaiden sold nearly as well as Shadow Dragon, and the series would continue from there. However, the legacy it would leave behind would be difficult to grasp. Fire Emblem Gaiden is the black sheep of the series. Unless you were sucked in and craving anything Fire Emblem, it's likely you didn't even know about Gaiden and what made it different until its remake. Fire Emblem Echo Shadows of Valentia was released for the Nintendo 3DS in 2017. When I talked about Shadow Dragon last time, I spoke primarily from my experience with the DS remake, since I never finished the original Famicom version. But my knowledge on Gaiden is far greater, so why put that knowledge to waste? For this video, I will be looking at both the original Famicom version as well as its 3DS remake. We switch gears to a neighboring continent of Arcanea, Valentia. The continent was shaped by two sibling gods, Duma and Milla. When the Age of Man came, the siblings held different ideals on how the people should be treated. Duma wants man to be strong, able to stand and fight for their keep, while Milla wishes for humans to live in peace and be blessed endlessly. So in order to resolve this, they made like any old pair of siblings and started a continental war! But the war ends with what is ultimately a stalemate, with the continent being divided in half, with Duma overseeing the north, which would be Regel, and Milla blessing the south, which would be Zofia. With the territories established, a divine accord was set by the gods and spanned across the continent, so that if the nations ever fought each other in war again, they would lose their protection, and terrors would sprout. Our story focuses on two childhood friends, Alm and Celica. Alm is the grandson of a retired Zofian general, while Celica is secretly the princess of Zofia, who was taken in by Alm's grandfather. The two become great friends, but Celica's discovery by rebel knights lead to their swift separation. Many long years pass, and for whatever reason, Emperor Rudolf of Vergel marched onto the Temple of Milla and sealed the divine dragon within the sacred blade Falchion. Not that Falchion, it's a different one. I don't get it either, let's just roll with it, okay? And because of this action, the divine accord breaks, which makes the world go to crap. Famine occurs, monsters begin to surface, and rebellion ignites in Zofia, resulting in the death of its king. Don't worry too much about it, Celica. It's not a Fire Emblem game, unless your dad dies. When the calling for our protagonists come, both end up fighting in the war with different means for the same goal. Alm fights by leading the Deliverance Revolution and later the Zophian army onto Regel soil, while Celica continues on a separate mission to discover the truth on what happened to Milla, as well as find her way safely home. This was the first game in the series where you viewed the story from multiple perspectives. You led both Alm and Celica through the world simultaneously, discovering more as you explored further north. Despite the complexity and backstory being far more involved than in Shadow Dragon, Gaiden's plot overall was still very elementary. Dialogue was played out very quickly, and the majority of the story pretty much is just there to keep things moving. But what Gaiden does better in comparison to Shadow Dragon is that it takes more time to establish its world. Medeus was a dragon that was simply evil, at least given what Shadow Dragon provided for us. Duma and Milla are sibling gods with different ideals. Even Rudolph introduces a new dynamic for the series, a villain that's not a tyrant or merciless killer. There's more to appreciate here, however what is presented feels very much like a Famicom story. However, the story to Shadows of Valentia is a completely different beast. While still following the same premise as the original game, Shadows of Valentia does so much to expand upon what was originally there, and ends up creating one of the best stories that Fire Emblem has ever told. Not only does it give brand new story context for nearly every fight in the game, it adds in completely new story elements. The game starts with a new prologue showing Alm and Celica as children. New battles were added, never before seen in Gaiden, new characters such as Berkut and Fernand, and nearly everything from Gaiden is translated into this remake. Like when approaching Nui Baba's abode, there's this weird out-of-place narration that never appears anywhere else in the game, and they still kept it for Shadows of Valentia. The reason I think the remake succeeds as well as it does is because it focuses in on the characters and not the story. If you're going to stick around with this video series, pay attention. This part is really important. What I mean by this is while Gaiden's plot is still overall more developed and better than Shadow Dragon's, it isn't exceedingly great. You could still summarize what goes down in a few sentences without much trouble. No one really had a personality in Gaiden. No one had a personality in Shadow Dragon DS. It was harder to connect with the battle since these characters were closer to husks with a name. But that is completely different for Shadows of Valentia. Alm has quickly become one of my favorite lords of the series. He's kind and sees the best in people, typical of most protagonists, sure, but in this game not everyone is with him. Even his friends come to question some of his decisions. But no matter what situation happens, be it dramatic or humorous, they're all still great friends despite their different thinking. Gray, Tobin, Lucas, Clive, Claire, they all add so much to Alm, making every moment in their journey appear far more important. You can even talk with nearly every one of your soldiers in between battles. This is the most human any characters in the series have become, and it's become one of my favorite casts in Fire Emblem. If not the favorite.
Listen, just stop and think about this. I know it's hard, but try. Claire is a girl, and if we save a girl... Huh? You follow? I can't believe you're the same man who mocks the fact that I fight for gold. Yes, because it's gold. This is girls. Don't you like girls?
I imagine the reason why Shadow Dragon didn't resonate with a lot of people is because it didn't bother to try and include more characterization into the story. The overall story isn't perfect though. Call it hindsight bias after playing Gaiden, but Shadows of Valentia leans a little too heavily into its plot twists. I can't speak for everyone when I say they're predictable, but with every new element in the remake, I would say the plot spoils itself. Shadows of Valentia still has one of the best stories in the series, but a few of those problems still keep it from being the best, in my opinion. While the story was a needed departure from the first game, the gameplay really goes double down on differences. This is going to be one of the most interesting videos in the retrospective. Gaiden is still the grid-based RPG the first game made us very familiar with, yet this installment brought a lot of firsts for the series, but also a lot of new ideas that would never be revisited again. Fire Emblem is known as a series of strategy RPGs, but the meta of Gaiden suggests it is more of a management RPG. Not that strategy is completely devoid, but it takes less tactical thinking to see this journey through to the end than you might think. Here's a short example. Pegasus Riders are a class that are weak to archers in every single Fire Emblem game, except for Gaiden. And a lot more mechanics and design choices really complement the idea of it being a management RPG. The most notable addition is that of the world map. We could talk for a while about how significant of a change this was for the series, but let's just keep it simple. Let's just say that this addition made Gaiden a far more flexible game to play in comparison to Shadow Dragon, but that did not mean this game was for casuals. In the original Gaiden, grinding was an unfortunate necessity. However, this was notably toned down for the 3DS remake. The world map should be noted as something which is actually more linear than it sounds. You basically only have one path you'll be moving down, even when it looks like you'll have multiple paths. Granted, the game will give you options on where you may want to go first, starting with a brief proof of concept in Act 2, a little bit after you board a ship for the mainland. Time to boat in Shadows of Valentia was about 4 hours, provided you don't skip dialogue or grind excessively, and... I'm sorry, I don't know where that came from. Let's move on. The world map made this game play more like a traditional RPG. And what is an RPG without towns and dungeons? In the original Gaiden, you could freely explore towns and talk to NPCs for quests, information, or even recruitment. It's a little less remarkable than that sounds though. Villages never consisted of more than 2 buildings and a handful of people. Dungeons also kinda sucked. Pretty much until Act 1, every dungeon in the game was a single room you walk through before you get into a group of enemies. The later dungeons were still somewhat basic, but more satisfactory to the exploration aspect. The Lost Woods in this game can kiss a very smelly place of mind, however. Shadows of Valentia made a lot of changes in this regard. You couldn't walk around towns anymore. Each one played more like a visual novel, something similar to a Phoenix Wright game. Aside from the chit-chat, you could examine your surroundings to gather items or check in to see what funny joke Alm has cooked up in his head. I miss being able to walk around towns admittedly, but it does feel appropriate for Fire Emblem to explore in a more tactile way. The dungeons were the remake's biggest improvement. You can freely walk around them like before, but there's much more to interact with. You could break open pots, enemies were spread around the various rooms, and you could find treasure chests. The level design was more than just a single room, and Almond Selic would give a little bit more context for what the place was before it became a hideout for bandits or monsters. I hope that dungeons become a mainstay in the Fire Emblem series sometime in the near future. There's a lot that can be expanded upon here, and if it realizes its full potential, then hoo boy! The world map and dungeon exploration were not the only ways Gaiden was a flexible game. At the start of the game in Chapter 1, you could recruit 3 additional units. Each one started as a villager class, which were about as useful as a nearly dead battery and a flashlight. Can serve their purpose for a little bit, but should be quickly swapped for something better. However, what made Gaiden unique is that a villager could promote into any one of 5 classes. Faye was a little bit different in this regard, though you should realistically promote everyone you can into a mercenary anyway. This is because taking this branch would lead into my favorite class type in the entire Fire Emblem series, introducing Gaiden. Myrmidons. They're not quite the same as they would be later in the series, but they're still fast, they almost always hit their target, they crit like champions, and they promote into Dread Fighters, which are easily the most broken class in the game. Not to mention, if you completely level up a Dread Fighter, they can demote back into a villager, keeping all their earned stats in tow. So if you decide to keep cycling through the mercenary class, they can perpetually level up and become the beefiest of beefcakes you'll ever have seen in the series. Speaking of, I guess another key difference in Gaiden is promotions work a little bit differently. In nearly every Fire Emblem game, you needed to use a special item on a unit in order to change their class once they reached level 10. Promoting them would grant them access to more weapons, as well as some fixed stat increases. In Gaiden, there was no special items required, but you needed to bring your ready to promote units to a Milla statue. There were less class types overall in Gaiden, but there was a way it made up for this. Another feature added to Gaiden was a 3rd tier promotion. Discounting the villager class, each character could promote twice, and unlike other entries in the series, fixed stats weren't given upon class change, but instead, every stat in the game increased to a base level. It's best to promote your units as early as you can. Having a few more stat increases overall is a neat bonus, but don't waste too much time on getting increases they're likely to get anyway. There were even some smaller tweaks made, the inventory system probably being the biggest and most notable aspect of this. Nearly every weapon in Shadow Dragon had a limited number of uses before they broke. Now, every soldier is automatically equipped with a weapon. However, the inventory system in Gaiden was vastly different. Every unit can only carry 1 item at a time. By equipping a new weapon, the unit's base attack power would be increased. This meant 2 things. One is that equipped weapons did not break. There was no need to buy new weapons or armor because it would de-incentivize going into dungeons to explore. This also led to currency being removed entirely from Gaiden, and that eventually led to not needing to manage your soldiers' inventory, at least not in the same way as before. Fire Emblem Echo Shadows of Valentia does bring back a currency system, but what was interesting about this is that money was typically only found in dungeons, or selling the things you found in them. Additionally, food was also added into the remake as a way to restore health and fatigue upon using it. But if you were carrying a restorative item, you also couldn't carry a weapon. Another way weapons play into the more management-focused meta of Shadows of Valentia is that soldiers who used a certain item long enough could learn new skills whenever they used that weapon. And some of those skills can be pretty useful too, so make sure to consider the long-term usage of these weapons. But with weapon durability gone, how does that affect magic? Magic tomes were used by mages as their de facto weapon, however new spells cannot be bought in this game. Each magic class will learn new skills over time as they level up, akin to more traditional RPGs like Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest. Yet each magic spell had a different health cost in order to use those spells. Sounds like a bad idea, right? Well, you don't have much of a choice. Not only do most enemies have typically low resistance, but it also ignores terrain bonuses. A fire spell will always have an 80% chance to hit, all other factors remaining constant. So as you can tell by what we've already discussed, Gaiden introduced many new ideas, as well as changed pre-existing ones. Not everything made a graceful transition to Gaiden, however. The map design in Gaiden suffered greatly in comparison to the original game. Terrain is a lot more effective in this game, but there's also a lot more flat land. The maps in Gaiden aren't very memorable, and there are times where the map design can be straight up bad. They certainly complement the route the enemy objective, but there are better ways to do it. There was clearly a quantity over quality issue here. They are more bearable in the remake, but the issues are never fixed. Things the remake did fix, however, are the replayability of Gaiden. After you finish the original game, there was no need to ever return to it. Shadows of Valentia adds in DLC and amiibo support for more content, as shady as those backdoor deals are, but it also adds in a brand new post-game chapter and support conversations. Shadow Dragon's remake was criticized for not including something as simple as that, so it's refreshing to see them here. But the feature added that really turned some heads is Milla's turn wheel. Did you make a stupid mistake? Did RNG screw you over? Are you crying now that your favorite character is dead? Well, what if I told you there's a way to turn back the clock? With the press of a button, you can go back as far as you want to any point in the battle and correct any mistakes or shortcomings along the way. Milla's turn wheel fixes all of these problems, and it's busted. Despite the limited uses, I only ever found one situation where I actually ran out of them. I think we could be talking if we could only set time as far back as the previous turn, but in its current form, it's too broken, even for Gaiden. I don't think I would want to see a mainline Fire Emblem game use this system. However, I would be absolutely fine if similar mechanics would find their way into future Fire Emblem remakes. I'm not saying that I'm opposed to the idea, and if it appeared in the same form for future Fire Emblem games, I wouldn't complain. But I think there are some potential ways we could balance it out further. Similar to the previous episode, going forward with each new game in the series we cover, I'm going to ask the question if this game would be a good starting point to someone who's completely new to the series. So is Gaiden worthy of being your first Fire Emblem? Nope! Neither original game nor remake I feel is a suitable place for a newcomer to begin the series with, especially since the gameplay is so radically different from any other Fire Emblem. If you play this game first, you could potentially set yourself up for the wrong idea for what this series would be if you decide to go forward. And with certain characters, thematic points, and settings, I would feel it's worth it to play Shadow Dragon before coming to this game. Though even that much isn't so important. What is important is that you're familiar with the series before going into this game. Otherwise, I feel it's harder to appreciate. If you don't care much for Fire Emblem, but based on what was described to you in the video, this sounds like it could really be your jam, then who am I to stop you? The story is still self-contained, and while some knowledge of the Arcanean saga is recommended, it's not required. For the people who are a little more familiar with Fire Emblem, Shadows of Valentia is the most optimal way to play this game. However, if you're still unsure, I would recommend finding a way to play the original Gaiden if you can. It's a very similar experience to its remake despite being 25 years old. The story doesn't have much presence, the UI is worse, and some other minor features like weapon arts aren't present. But other than that, it's pretty much one-to-one with its remake. No matter which version of the game you play, both will last around 40 hours of playtime on a casual playthrough. So if you're coming in, buckle up and get comfy, so you can fully appreciate this game proper. And appreciate this game you should. Fire Emblem Gaiden is a weird game. The metagame is totally different from any other, there isn't an appearance from series renowned character Anna, and there isn't even an object representing the Fire Emblem in this game. But even without these elements, Gaiden is still enjoyable. A big reason the fans of this game love it as much as they do is because of how different it is from other games in the series. Do I want to see a game that follows in Gaiden's footsteps in the future? Nah thanks. Having a game similar to it would only take away from Gaiden's uniquity. Besides, there are some things about this game that are a pain. It's a nice little side story for the series. A game to be respected, but a game to be remembered as the black sheep. I will always love this game. It's probably in my top 5 for the series. If you're a fan of Fire Emblem, do not snooze on this game. There's a lot here to be appreciated. After this deviation, we'll be coming back to something a little bit more traditional. Next time we will return to familiar ground, both metaphorically and literally. Marth's journey would continue with the third game in the series, where a great mystery would unfold before it. Thank you so much for watching, and may we meet on the battlefield yet again.